The rain had been pouring down for hours, turning the streets of New York into rivers of cold, filthy water. Caleb sat on the steps of an abandoned building, his soaked hoodie clinging to his thin frame. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the gnawing hunger felt like it was eating him alive from the inside. The city buzzed around him, people rushing by with umbrellas and raincoats, unaware of the boy shivering on the steps. He had tried everything, begged for food, searched through trash bins, but New York was a place that chewed you up and spit you out, especially someone like him, an 18-year-old kid with no family, no friends, and no future. Caleb had always been resilient, or at least he tried to be, but tonight, his strength was failing. Every muscle in his body screamed for warmth, for something to eat, for just one person to care. But the world didn't care, and he was learning that the hard way. His fingers trembled as he pulled his hood tighter around his face, trying to block out the rain and the biting wind. "There's got to be something," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. But there wasn't. He had checked every corner of this block, and no one was willing to give him even a scrap. The sun was setting, casting the streets in an eerie glow as the streetlights flickered on. As the city shifted from its hurried day pace to the quiet, ominous hum of night, Caleb knew staying out here was dangerous. He had seen other homeless kids get jumped, or worse, during the late hours. But where could he go? Shelters were full, and the ones that weren't were just as dangerous. Just as he was about to give in to despair, a sleek, black limousine pulled up across the street. It was the kind of car Caleb had only ever seen in movies, the kind driven by people so rich that they didn't even have to look at the world he lived in. The car's window rolled down just slightly, revealing the shadow of someone inside. For a moment, Caleb thought it was just his exhausted mind playing tricks on him. But then, the back door opened. A man stepped out, tall and well-dressed, with an umbrella in hand. He didn't belong here, not in this part of the city. His suit screamed wealth, and the way he carried himself was different from anyone Caleb had ever met. Caleb's heart raced. The man's cold eyes scanned the street before they landed on him, their gazes locking for what felt like an eternity. Caleb's stomach churned, and not just from hunger. Something about the man's presence sent a shiver down his spine. The way he looked at him. It was like he was assessing him, weighing his worth, deciding if he was even worth the time. Without thinking, Caleb forced himself to stand. His legs wobbled beneath him, weak from hunger and exhaustion. The man tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk forming on his lips, but he didn't say a word. Caleb's voice cracked as he shouted across the street, "I have no more options." The man stood still, observing him in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Caleb felt his heart pounding in his chest, every second dragging out, the cold rain making his bones ache. He was a kid on the brink of collapse, standing in front of a man who had everything Caleb had ever wanted. Power, wealth, control. He knew it. The man knew it. And for a moment, the entire world seemed to hang in the balance of what this stranger would say next. Finally, the man took a slow step forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the wet pavement. His voice, low and composed, cut through the rain like a knife. "I don't help beggars," he said, his tone sharp and without sympathy. The words struck Caleb like a punch to the gut. He staggered slightly, the last shred of hope he had been holding onto slipping away. He clenched his fists, not out of anger, but out of pure desperation. He didn't care anymore. Pride had abandoned him long ago, along with everything else. "But I'm not asking for charity," Caleb shouted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. His voice echoed in the nearly empty street, but the man didn't flinch. "I'll work. I'll do anything. Just please." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if considering him more seriously now. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the rain hitting the pavement. Then, with a calculated breath, the man finally spoke. "Anything, you say?" He raised an eyebrow, as if testing the boy's resolve. Caleb nodded furiously, his heart thundering in his chest. He didn't know what he was agreeing to, but he couldn't go back to the steps of that building. He couldn't go back to being invisible, to being nothing. The man stepped closer, until he was standing directly in front of Caleb, the umbrella barely covering them both. His eyes bore into Caleb's, sharp and piercing, as if they could see right through him. "Come with me," the man said, his voice as cold as the rain falling around them. "We'll see what you're really made of." Caleb hesitated for only a second, then nodded. He had nothing left to lose. As the limousine's door opened again and Caleb climbed inside, his mind raced with uncertainty. He had no idea where this decision would lead him, but for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of something that had almost been extinguished: hope. The soft leather of the limousine seat felt foreign beneath Caleb's trembling body. It was warmer inside the car, but his nerves wouldn't let him feel any comfort. The man sat across from him, his face partially obscured by the dim light in the vehicle. Caleb couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of being judged, scrutinized like he was some kind of experiment. The hum of the engine was the only sound as the car slid through the rain-soaked streets, leaving behind the grimy corner Caleb had called home. The silence was thick and suffocating. Caleb wanted to say something, anything to break it, but he couldn't find the words. He kept his eyes down, watching his hands fidget in his lap. The man was motionless, his sharp eyes occasionally flicking toward Caleb, as though assessing his every breath, every twitch of his fingers. Finally, the man spoke, his voice calm but commanding. "What's your name?" "Caleb," he answered quickly, his throat dry. "Caleb Stevens." The man leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other. "I'm William Blackwood," he said, as if that name alone was supposed to mean something. And maybe it did. Blackwood. It sounded familiar, like a name Caleb had heard in passing on the news or seen in headlines on newspapers he used to walk by, back when he had a home. But right now, it didn't matter. "What do you want from me?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He regretted the question almost as soon as it left his mouth. He was in no position to make demands, but the words were driven by his growing anxiety. William didn't answer right away. Instead, he observed Caleb for a long, uncomfortable moment, his lips pressing into a thin line as if calculating his next move. Then, with a cold precision, he replied, "Tell me, Caleb, why should I help you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, one that Caleb wasn't prepared for. He stared at William, his mind scrambling for a response, but all he could think about was the hunger gnawing at his insides, the ache in his limbs from days of sleeping on concrete. What kind of answer was this man looking for? I don't know," Caleb stammered, feeling a flush of shame creep up his neck. I have nowhere else to go." William raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Is that it? No grand reason? No ambition or dream you're chasing?" Caleb blinked, surprised by the question. Of course he had dreams, but those had been buried long ago, hidden under layers of survival instincts. What did it matter now? What good were dreams when you couldn't even find a meal? "I used to want to go to college," Caleb admitted quietly, almost to himself. "I wanted to study architecture, build things, but that's not possible anymore." William's eyes flickered with something Caleb couldn't quite read. Interest? Curiosity? Whatever it was, it vanished quickly, replaced by that same impassive expression. "You think your circumstances define you?" William asked, his voice carrying a cold edge. "That because you're down now, you can't rise?" Caleb was taken aback by the question, unsure how to respond. He had always believed that once you were pushed far enough into the gutter, there was no coming back. That life didn't just hand out second chances. But here he was, sitting in a limousine with a man who had enough money to change his life in an instant. "I don't know what I think anymore," Caleb muttered, barely loud enough for William to hear. The car began to slow, and Caleb glanced out the window. They had arrived at a massive iron gate that stood in front of a sprawling estate, the likes of which Caleb had only seen in magazines or on TV. The mansion was enormous, looming like a fortress in the darkness, its stone walls slick with rain. The gates creaked open, and the car glided up the long driveway, flanked by meticulously manicured lawns and towering trees that lined the path like silent sentinels. Caleb's pulse quickened. Where was he? What had he gotten himself into? As they approached the front entrance, the door to the limousine opened, and William stepped out first, not bothering to glance back at Caleb. After a hesitant moment, Caleb followed, stepping out into the cold air. He shivered, though this time it wasn't just from the temperature. "Follow me," William commanded, walking briskly toward the grand double doors of the mansion. Caleb hurried to keep up, feeling smaller with each step. The mansion loomed above him, its dark windows reflecting nothing but shadows. Inside, the space was even more intimidating. High ceilings, marble floors, and priceless art hanging on the walls greeted them. It was the kind of place that whispered wealth and power at every turn. William didn't slow his pace, leading Caleb through several hallways until they reached a large room with a roaring fireplace. The warmth was immediate, but Caleb still felt a chill creeping up his spine. Without waiting for an invitation, William sat in one of the leather armchairs, gesturing for Caleb to take the one opposite him. Caleb hesitated but sat down, feeling awkward and out of place in such a luxurious setting. "Here's the deal," William began, his tone direct. "I can give you everything you need. Food, shelter, money, but nothing comes for free." Caleb swallowed hard, his throat tight. Of course, there was always a catch. He waited, unsure of what kind of deal William was about to propose. "You say you'll work for me," William continued, his sharp gaze locked on Caleb. "But the kind of work I need requires more than just labor. I need someone I can trust, someone who won't question orders, someone willing to do whatever it takes." Caleb's heart raced. Whatever it takes. What did that even mean? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He had thought he was desperate before, but now, sitting in front of this man, he realized just how far desperation could really go. "I'm offering you a choice," William said, leaning forward slightly. "Stay out there in the streets, where you'll likely starve or worse. Or come under my roof, accept my terms, and see just how far you're willing to go for a second chance." Caleb felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run as fast as he could. But where would he go? Back to the streets? Back to nothing? His eyes met William's once again, and for a brief moment, he saw something in the man's gaze. Not kindness, but an opportunity. "I'll do it," Caleb whispered, his voice shaky but resolute. "Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it." William's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Good," he said simply. "Then your new life begins now." The next morning, Caleb awoke in a bed so large and soft it felt like a dream. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The rich, dark wood paneling of the room, the velvet curtains, and the expensive furniture looked like something out of a different life. Slowly, the events of the previous night came rushing back. The rain, the limo, William Blackwood. Panic surged in his chest as he sat up, scanning the room. Was this real? Could this be his new life? He gingerly swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. Everything around him screamed luxury, from the silk sheets to the marble bathroom he had only glimpsed through an open door. But the unease from last night lingered. Caleb got dressed in the clean clothes that had been left for him, a simple pair of black pants and a gray button-down shirt. The fabric was soft against his skin, and he had to fight the urge to lose himself in the comfort. No, he needed to stay focused. He had agreed to something, but he didn't know what yet. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened slightly, and a woman, probably in her mid-40s, stepped inside. She was dressed in a neatly pressed uniform and carried an air of strict professionalism. Her eyes flicked over Caleb as if she were sizing him up. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you downstairs," she said crisply, her tone not unkind, but not warm either. She motioned for him to follow. Caleb nodded, wordlessly standing and trailing behind her as they navigated the mansion's labyrinth of hallways. The opulence of the place was overwhelming. Polished floors, priceless art, and chandeliers that glittered even in the daylight. Everything felt so far removed from the life Caleb had known just 24 hours ago. The thought made his stomach twist. They finally reached a grand dining room. The long table, polished to a high shine, looked more suited for a banquet than breakfast, but at the far end, William sat alone, sipping a black coffee and reading a newspaper. His eyes lifted as Caleb approached, the same cold, calculating gaze from the night before assessing him yet again. "Sit," William instructed, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. His voice was calm, controlled, and though his tone was neutral, it carried an unspoken authority that made Caleb feel like he had no choice but to obey. Caleb sat down, his back stiff, hands clenched in his lap. He could feel William's eyes on him, waiting, watching. "I hope you slept well," William began, his voice smooth, but there was no warmth in the words. It was a formality, a habit, not genuine concern. "I did," Caleb replied quietly, trying to steady his voice. "Thank you." William gave a small nod. "You accepted my offer last night," he said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "I want to make sure you understand what that means." Caleb's throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet William's gaze. "I'll do whatever it takes," he repeated, the same words he'd said last night. But now, in the cold light of day, they felt heavier, more dangerous. William studied him for a long moment before speaking. "We'll start small," he said, his voice cool and methodical. "Your first task is simple: deliver a package for me. There's an address, not far from here, where it needs to be dropped off. No questions, no deviations, just the delivery." Caleb felt a flicker of relief. A delivery? That didn't sound so bad. He had expected worse, something that would demand more from him, test his limits. This he could do. "Okay," Caleb agreed quickly. "I can do that." William's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. "Good." Without another word, he slid a small black box across the table, about the size of a shoebox, tied with a single red ribbon. There were no markings on it, nothing to indicate what was inside. Caleb reached for it, but William's hand shot out, gripping the box tightly before Caleb could take it. "There's one rule," William said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You do not, under any circumstances, open this box. Is that clear?" Caleb blinked, caught off guard by the sudden intensity in William's voice. He nodded quickly. "I understand." William's eyes lingered on Caleb's for a moment longer before releasing the box into his hands. Caleb felt the weight of it immediately, not heavy, but somehow significant. He swallowed hard, the unease from the night before returning full force. "James will drive you," William said, motioning toward the door where the woman who had escorted Caleb stood waiting. "Don't make me regret giving you this chance." Caleb nodded, clutching the box tightly in his hands. He didn't dare ask what was inside or why it needed to be delivered in such secrecy. He had a feeling he didn't want to know. This was his chance to prove himself, to show William that he could be trusted, that he wasn't just some kid from the streets. But as he followed the woman, James apparently, back through the mansion, doubt began to creep in. What was he getting himself into? Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the pale morning sun. A sleek black car was waiting for him in the driveway. James opened the door, and Caleb slid into the back seat, still clutching the mysterious box. The drive was silent, and the weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on him. The city passed by in a blur of gray buildings and wet streets, but all Caleb could think about was the box sitting in his lap, its presence feeling more ominous with each passing minute. What if he made a mistake? What if something went wrong? They pulled up to a nondescript building in a quiet part of town. The neighborhood wasn't bad, but it wasn't luxurious either. It was the kind of place people passed through without giving it much thought. Caleb's heart raced as he opened the car door, stepping out onto the wet pavement. He glanced at James, who gave him a brief nod before motioning toward the building. Caleb took a deep breath, clutching the box tighter, and walked toward the door. His mind raced with questions, but he shoved them down. This was his test. All he had to do was deliver the box. Nothing more, nothing less. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then the door creaked open just a crack. A pair of dark, suspicious eyes peered out at him. "You got it?" a gruff voice asked. Caleb nodded quickly, holding up the box. The door opened a little wider, and a hand reached out, snatching the box from his grasp. Caleb barely had time to process the exchange before the door slammed shut in his face. He stood there for a moment, stunned. That was it? It was over so quickly, so anticlimactic. but relief washed over him all the same. He had done it. His first task was complete. Caleb turned and walked back toward the car, his steps lighter than before. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe he could handle this new life, whatever it was. But as he reached for the car door, a sudden, gnawing feeling twisted in his gut. Something about the exchange felt wrong. The way the man had grabbed the box, the quickness of it all. He shook his head, trying to brush off the feeling. It didn't matter. He had done what he was asked to do. For now, that was enough. The car ride back to the mansion was eerily silent. Caleb sat in the back seat, replaying the delivery over and over in his mind. Something wasn't right. He could still feel the cold weight of the box in his hands, could still see the door slamming shut in front of him without a word of thanks. But what else had he expected? He'd done what William asked, no questions asked, just like he'd promised. As they pulled up to the mansion, Caleb forced himself to focus. He wasn't in the position to be questioning anything. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to escape the streets, to build a new life. He needed to remind himself of that. Still, the unease clung to him like the morning fog that hadn't quite lifted from the city. James parked the car, and Caleb stepped out, making his way up the front steps. His heart raced as he pushed open the heavy oak door and entered the grand foyer. The silence of the mansion was overwhelming, the emptiness stretching before him like a vacuum that threatened to swallow him whole. Before he could even consider what to do next, William appeared from a hallway. His expression was unreadable, but his piercing eyes bore into Caleb like he was scanning him for any signs of weakness. "Did you deliver the package?" William asked, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of something Caleb couldn't quite place. Caleb nodded quickly, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yeah, I delivered it." William's eyes narrowed slightly, as if studying his face for any sign of hesitation. Caleb could feel the intensity of his gaze, the way it seemed to search for cracks in his resolve. "Good," William finally said. His tone clipped. "You've passed the first test." "First test?" Caleb's stomach tightened. He should have known it wouldn't be that simple. There was always more with men like William. But before Caleb could respond, William motioned for him to follow. Already turning and heading toward the back of the mansion, Caleb hesitated for just a moment before trailing behind him, the soft click of his footsteps echoing through the marble halls. William led him to a part of the house he hadn't yet seen. A long, narrow corridor lined with doors, all closed, their dark wooden surfaces gleaming under the chandelier's light. At the end of the corridor was a room, its door slightly ajar. William pushed it open, revealing a study unlike anything Caleb had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes and antique artifacts. A large, mahogany desk sat in the center, perfectly organized with papers stacked neatly in one corner and a single lamp casting a soft glow over the room. William gestured toward one of the chairs in front of the desk. "Sit." Caleb sat down, his pulse quickening. The tension in the air was thick, and Caleb could feel that whatever was coming next was far from simple. William sat behind the desk, folding his hands in front of him. His eyes were sharp, unblinking, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I've given you a glimpse of what it means to work for me. What I offer isn't just shelter or food. It's power, control, and most importantly, loyalty." Caleb swallowed hard, unsure where this conversation was heading. "But power," William continued, his voice taking on a more dangerous tone, "comes with a price." Caleb's breath caught in his throat as William leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "There are things in my world that you don't understand yet, but you will in time." William paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You've entered a game, Caleb, and once you're in, there's no turning back." The words hung in the air like a threat, sending a chill down Caleb's spine. But he couldn't back out now. He had made his choice. "I understand," Caleb said quietly, though the truth was, he wasn't sure he did. Not completely. William leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Caleb's. "Do you? Because from here on out, things get more complicated, and you'll be expected to handle whatever comes your way." Caleb nodded, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? He had thought this would be simple. work in exchange for food, a roof over his head. But this was something else entirely. "Let me make one thing clear," William said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "You follow my orders, no questions asked. If you break that rule, if you fail me, there won't be any more chances." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He understood the warning, even if he didn't fully grasp what was at stake. He had no choice but to nod in agreement. The silence that followed was heavy, but Caleb knew better than to break it. William studied him for another long moment before leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't always like this, you know," William said suddenly, his voice quieter, almost reflective. The shift in tone caught Caleb off guard. He had never seen this side of William. The man always seemed so controlled, so distant. But there was something in his eyes now, something Caleb couldn't quite place. Regret? Pain? "I came from nothing too," William continued, his gaze drifting toward the window. "Not so different from you." Caleb blinked, surprised by the admission. He had assumed William had always been wealthy, that he had been born into this world of power and privilege. But the way William spoke now, the way his voice softened when he talked about his past, told a different story. "When you're at the bottom," William said, his voice low, "you learn quickly who you can trust. You learn that survival doesn't come easy. And you learn that to rise, you have to be willing to do things you never thought possible." Caleb sat still, absorbing William's words. For the first time since he had met the man, he felt a flicker of understanding. William wasn't just testing him, he was preparing him for a world where there were no second chances, where mistakes weren't forgiven. "You'll see soon enough," William said, his gaze shifting back to Caleb, his cold demeanor returning. "This life comes with choices. Make the right ones, and you'll never have to worry again. Make the wrong ones." His voice trailed off, but the unspoken threat lingered in the air. Caleb clenched his fists in his lap, determination coursing through him. He couldn't fail. Not now. Not after everything he had already been through. He had come too far to turn back. "I won't fail you," Caleb said, his voice stronger now. "I'll do whatever it takes." William's eyes narrowed, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. "Good," he said quietly, "because your next test will push you to your limits. Let's see if you're ready." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. What was coming next? What test would William have for him now? He didn't know, but one thing was certain. He had no choice but to prove himself, no matter the cost. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. Caleb didn't sleep that night. After his conversation with William, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning with uncertainty. The weight of William's words pressed down on him like an invisible force. "You'll be tested." He didn't know what the test would be, but the fear of failing gnawed at him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. William was offering more than a way out of the streets. He was offering power, control, something bigger than Caleb had ever imagined. But the price was still a mystery. When morning came, Caleb dragged himself out of bed, his body aching from the restless night. He dressed in the same clean clothes that had been left for him and made his way downstairs. The mansion was quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of a distant clock. He found himself in the dining room again, but this time there was no food, no welcoming table. Instead, William was waiting for him, standing by the window, his back to the room. As Caleb entered, William turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Today is the day," William said, his voice calm, yet it held an air of finality. "I have a task for you." Caleb felt his stomach churn. The test. William walked toward the table, where a manila envelope sat in the center. Without a word, he slid it across to Caleb. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for it, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "What's inside?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. William's eyes darkened. "Open it." Caleb hesitated for a moment before slowly peeling open the envelope. Inside were a single sheet of paper and a photograph. He pulled the photograph out first, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a picture of a man, maybe in his late 30s, standing outside a modest apartment building. He didn't look like anyone important. His clothes were simple, his face unremarkable. But something about the image made Caleb's pulse quicken. "He's not what he seems," William said, his voice low and measured. "That man, Jacob Rivers, owes me something." Caleb frowned, glancing between the photograph and William. "What does he owe you?" William's expression hardened. "That's not important. What's important is that you're going to get it back for me." Caleb's mouth went dry. "What do you mean? What am I supposed to do?" William stepped closer, his presence suffocating, his gaze cold and unwavering. "I need you to deliver a message to Mr. Rivers," he said, his voice so calm it sent a shiver down Caleb's spine. "But this time, it's not just a package. I need you to go to him. Make him understand that there's no running from his debt." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. What kind of message are we talking about? William's lips curled into a small, chilling smile. "You'll be firm, but you won't harm him. Not unless it's necessary." The room seemed to spin for a moment. Caleb knew what William was asking, even if he didn't spell it out. He was being asked to intimidate, to confront, and if things went wrong, to do something he never thought he'd be capable of. Caleb swallowed hard, the words sticking in his throat. "And if he doesn't listen?" William's gaze didn't falter. "He will, if you do it right." Caleb stared at the photograph again, his mind racing. How had things escalated so quickly? Just days ago, he had been on the streets, desperate for a meal. Now, he was being dragged into something darker, something dangerous. I don't know if I can do this," Caleb whispered, the weight of it all crashing down on him. William's eyes narrowed, and he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You said you'd do anything? Now's the time to prove it." Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He couldn't back out now. He had made his choice the moment he stepped into that limousine, the moment he had taken the first step into William's world. But this was something else entirely. "I don't expect failure, Caleb," William continued, his voice cold and firm. "Jacob will pay what he owes, one way or another. You need to understand that this is more than a simple task. This is your chance to show me where your loyalty lies." Loyalty. The word echoed in Caleb's mind like a warning bell. He had never been loyal to anyone, not because he didn't want to be, but because no one had ever given him the chance. Now, William was offering him something, but the cost, it was steep. Caleb clenched his fists, his heart racing. He wasn't a violent person. He had never been the kind of guy to get into fights or push people around. But as he looked at William, standing there with that calm, dangerous smile, he realized something. This wasn't about who he used to be. This was about survival. "I'll do it," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go to him." William's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good," he said softly. "But remember this, Caleb. In this world, hesitation will get you killed. Don't think twice. Don't show weakness." Caleb nodded, even though every fiber of his being was screaming to get out. He took the envelope, the photo of Jacob Rivers burning a hole in his hand. William didn't say another word, simply turned and left the room, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. That afternoon, Caleb found himself standing outside the same apartment building he'd seen in the photograph. It was a rundown place, the kind of building where no one asked questions and everyone kept to themselves. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked up the steps, his mind racing with everything that could go wrong. What if Rivers didn't listen? What if he tried to fight? Or worse, what if Caleb had to make good on William's unspoken threat? He stopped at the door to apartment 3B, his hand hovering over the worn brass knocker. "Do it," he told himself. "Just do it and get out." He knocked, and after a few tense moments, the door opened. The man from the photograph stood there, looking tired and worn, his eyes narrowing in suspicion the moment he saw Caleb. "Can I help you?" Rivers asked, his voice gruff. Caleb swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "I'm here on behalf of William Blackwood." At the mention of William's name, Rivers' face paled and his posture stiffened. He took a step back, fear flashing across his features. I don't have the money yet," Rivers stammered, his voice shaky. I need more time. Just a little more time. Caleb's stomach twisted. He hadn't been prepared for this. The fear, the desperation in the man's voice. This wasn't just about money. This was a man who was genuinely terrified of what might happen if he couldn't pay. You don't have time, Caleb said, trying to keep his voice steady. William's not willing to wait anymore. You need to pay up. River's eyes darted around, panic setting in. I can't. Please, just tell him I'll have it soon. I just need a few more days. Caleb felt the weight of William's warning hanging over him. No weakness. No hesitation. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. William doesn't care about your excuses. If you don't pay, there'll be consequences. River's eyes filled with tears, his hands shaking as he backed further into the apartment. Please, I'm begging you. Don't do this. Caleb hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't a thug. He wasn't a man who could scare people into paying debts. But here he was, standing in this man's doorway, feeling like a monster. Please, Rivers whispered again, his voice breaking. For the first time, Caleb felt the full weight of the decision he had made by stepping into William's world. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about becoming someone he didn't recognize. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as he stood frozen at the doorway of Jacob Rivers' small, dimly lit apartment. The man was trembling, his voice shaking with fear, and Caleb could feel the desperation pouring off of him like waves crashing against the shore. It was suffocating. Please, just give me more time, Rivers begged, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. I'm not running, I swear. I just need. Caleb's mind raced. This was it, the moment William had warned him about. No hesitation, no weakness. Caleb had to do what William expected, prove that he wasn't just some kid from the streets. But as he looked at Rivers, seeing the man's pleading eyes, it felt like everything inside of him was splitting apart. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He wasn't a thug sent to shake people down. He wasn't someone who threatened others for money. But the voice of survival echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. Do what you need to do. There was no going back now. You don't get more time, Caleb said, his voice trembling but firm. Williams made it clear. You either pay up, or what? Rivers interrupted, his eyes wide with fear. He stepped closer, his voice rising with panic. You'll hurt me? Break my legs? I can't give him what I don't have. His voice cracked, the desperation in his words piercing Caleb's chest like a knife. For a moment, everything stopped. The sound of traffic outside, the distant hum of the city, all of it faded into silence. Caleb's heart pounded in his ears, and he could feel the weight of what was about to happen. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong step would send him plummeting into something he couldn't come back from. I don't want to hurt you, Caleb said quietly, taking a step back. His voice was thick with emotion, and he could barely keep it steady. But if you don't pay him, someone else will come. Someone who won't hesitate. Rivers' face crumpled, his shoulders sagging in defeat. I'm dead either way, he whispered, his voice hollow. I don't have the money, and I don't know how to get it. William's not going to listen. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat dry. Rivers was right. William wasn't the kind of man to show mercy. He had made that clear. The world William lived in didn't have room for weakness or second chances. But Caleb wasn't like William. He didn't want to be. I can try to talk to him, Caleb blurted out before he could stop himself. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and impulsive. I'll tell him you just need more time. Rivers looked at Caleb with wide, shocked eyes, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. You do that? Caleb nodded, even though his mind screamed at him that this was a terrible idea. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing he could do. He had already crossed so many lines since meeting William, lines that had blurred the person he thought he was. This was his chance to do something right, to make sure he didn't lose himself completely. Thank you, Rivers whispered, his voice breaking with relief. Thank you, I don't know what else to say. Don't thank me yet, Caleb said, his voice low. I don't know if William will listen. Without another word, Caleb turned and walked out of the apartment, his mind racing as he descended the stairs. His heart pounded, and the weight of what he had just promised hit him hard. He had no idea how William would react, but one thing was certain: William wasn't going to like it. The drive back to the mansion felt longer than before, the tension coiling inside Caleb like a tight spring, ready to snap at any moment. When the car finally pulled into the driveway, Caleb's hands were slick with sweat. He wiped them on his pants as he climbed out, his legs heavy as he made his way up the stone steps. Inside, the mansion was as cold and silent as ever, but now it felt even more oppressive, like the walls were closing in around him. Caleb's chest tightened as he walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. He knew what was coming. He was about to face William Blackwood with news he knew wouldn't go over well. When he entered William's office, the man was already seated behind his desk, his fingers steepled together as if he had been waiting for this moment. His eyes locked onto Caleb the second he stepped inside, and Caleb felt the weight of that gaze settle over him like a lead blanket. "Sit," William said, his voice low and calm, but there was an edge to it that made Caleb's heart race. Caleb sat down, his hands trembling in his lap. He tried to steady his breathing, to calm the nerves threatening to overwhelm him, but it was impossible under William's cold, calculating stare. "How did it go?" William asked, his tone neutral, but Caleb could sense the undercurrent of danger in his voice. Caleb hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "Rivers, he doesn't have the money yet." William's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "And I told him I'd talk to you," Caleb stammered, the words coming out faster than he intended. "He just needs a little more time, and I thought—" "You thought?" William interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Caleb flinched. William stood up, his towering figure casting a long shadow over Caleb. His eyes were like ice, cold and unfeeling. "I didn't tell you to think, Caleb. I told you to deliver a message." Caleb's throat tightened, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He had expected this, but the intensity of William's reaction still sent a jolt of fear through him. "I'm sorry," Caleb blurted out, his voice small. "I just thought maybe—" "That's your problem," William snapped, his voice dangerously low. He walked around the desk, standing in front of Caleb, his gaze hard and unyielding. "You still think you can make deals, find a middle ground? But that's not how this world works. You don't negotiate with people like Rivers. You make them fear you." Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. He had made a mistake, a huge one, and now he was trapped in the consequences. "Look at me," William demanded, his voice cold. Caleb forced himself to meet William's gaze, the chill in his eyes sending a shiver down his spine. "You don't get to decide how this works. You want to survive in this world. You do what needs to be done. No hesitation, no weakness." Caleb swallowed hard, nodding quickly. He didn't trust his voice to speak. William leaned down, his voice a whisper now, but it was filled with menace. "You've disappointed me, Caleb, and I don't take kindly to disappointment." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, the terror almost choking him. He had tried to do the right thing, to hold on to the last bit of decency he had, but now it was all slipping away. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for any of it. "You have one last chance," William said, his voice like steel. "Fix this, or you'll regret it." Caleb's breath caught in his throat as William straightened, his eyes never leaving Caleb's. "Do I make myself clear?" "Yes," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. "Good," William said, his voice suddenly calm again. "You'll go back to Rivers tomorrow, and this time, you won't come back empty-handed." Caleb nodded, his entire body trembling as William walked past him, leaving the room without another word. The door clicked shut, and the silence of the mansion pressed down on Caleb like a weight he couldn't lift. He sat there, staring at the floor, the full reality of his situation sinking in. There was no going back now. He had made his choice, and there was no escaping the consequences. The next morning, the air in the mansion felt heavier, like the very walls knew what was coming. Caleb hadn't slept at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he replayed William's words from the night before. "You don't get to decide how this works. No hesitation, no weakness." The threat in William's voice still echoed in his mind, sending chills down his spine. He knew what had to be done, but every instinct in his body screamed against it. Caleb had spent the entire night wondering how it had come to this. Just a few days ago, he had been a homeless kid with nothing. Now, he was about to force a terrified man to pay up for a debt he didn't have the money to cover. Caleb wasn't cut out for this. He wasn't like William, capable of cold, calculated cruelty, but now, he was being pushed into a corner, and there was no escaping it. As he stood in the hallway, waiting for James to drive him back to Jacob Rivers' apartment, Caleb tried to push away the sickening dread that filled his stomach. He didn't know what he was going to do when he got there. Would Rivers have the money? If not, what was Caleb supposed to do? How far was William expecting him to go? The sound of footsteps approaching snapped Caleb out of his thoughts. James appeared in the doorway, his face expressionless as always. "The car's ready," he said quietly, his eyes betraying no emotion. Caleb nodded, forcing his legs to move as he followed James to the front door. Every step felt like it was taking him closer to the edge of a cliff, and he was powerless to stop it. The drive back to Rivers' apartment was suffocatingly silent. Caleb's mind was racing, his thoughts spinning out of control as the city blurred by outside the window. He tried to come up with a plan, a way out of this mess, but nothing made sense. Every scenario ended the same way, with him standing in front of Rivers, demanding what the man didn't have. When the car finally pulled up in front of the apartment building, Caleb felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. He sat there for a moment, staring at the door of Rivers' apartment, his heart pounding so loudly he thought James might hear it. "You know what needs to be done," James said softly, his eyes flicking toward Caleb in the rearview mirror. Caleb didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat felt too tight, his chest too heavy with fear. He nodded once, then opened the car door, stepping out onto the pavement. The air was colder than before, the sky dark with the threat of rain. It felt like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Caleb climbed the steps to the apartment, each footfall heavier than the last. When he reached the door of apartment 3B, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the knocker. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to walk away, to leave this entire nightmare behind. But William's words were there, in the back of his mind, louder than the fear. "Fix this, or you'll regret it." He knocked. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the door creaked open, and Rivers appeared. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot as if he hadn't slept. He looked even worse than before, as if the weight of his situation had crushed him overnight. "You again," Rivers muttered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I told you, I don't have it." Caleb swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "William's not going to wait any longer," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't have a choice, Rivers. If you don't pay him now, things are going to get worse." Rivers' eyes filled with a mixture of panic and anger. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, pacing back and forth in the small space of his apartment. "I told you," he snapped, his voice rising. "I don't have it. I don't know what to do." Caleb watched him, feeling the same helplessness rise in his own chest. He could see that Rivers wasn't lying. The man was completely out of options, but William didn't care. He wasn't interested in excuses, only results. And now, Caleb was stuck in the middle of a game he didn't know how to play. I don't know what to tell you," Caleb stammered, feeling the pressure mount inside him. "I'm just the messenger. But if you don't pay, William's going to send someone else. Someone who won't be as merciful." Rivers interrupted, his voice bitter. "You think this is mercy? You showing up here, threatening me?" Caleb flinched at the accusation. He didn't want to be this person, didn't want to be standing here, trying to scare a man who was already broken. But what choice did he have? William had made it clear. Either Caleb came back with results, or he wouldn't come back at all. Rivers suddenly stopped pacing, turning to face Caleb with a wild look in his eyes. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "William, he's not just some rich guy collecting debts. He's dangerous. He doesn't care about money. He cares about control." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the reality of the situation even worse. Rivers took a step closer, desperation etched across his face. "He'll destroy me if I don't pay," Rivers continued, his voice cracking. "But I can't give him what I don't have. Please, just tell him to give me more time. I'll figure something out, I swear." Caleb stared at Rivers, his mind racing. He wanted to believe the man, wanted to think there was a way out of this for both of them. But he had seen the look in William's eyes, had heard the coldness in his voice. There was no more time. William had already decided Rivers' fate, and now it was up to Caleb to deliver it. "I can't," Caleb whispered, the words burning in his throat. "I can't go back to him without something." Rivers' eyes darkened, and for a moment, the desperation turned to something else, something more dangerous. "You don't get it, do you?" he spat, taking another step toward Caleb. "I'm not the only one he's after. People like William. They'll chew you up and spit you out. You think you're doing his dirty work for a place to sleep? You're just a pawn." The accusation hit Caleb harder than he expected. A pawn. That's what he felt like. A piece being moved around in a game he didn't understand. But the worst part was, Rivers was right. William didn't care about him. He was just another tool, another weapon to be used and discarded. But Caleb couldn't afford to think like that. Not now. "You don't understand," Caleb said, his voice strained. "If I don't come back with something, William." Before he could finish, Rivers grabbed him by the collar, pulling him close. His eyes were wild, frantic. "You think he'll protect you? You think you matter to him?" Rivers' voice was rising, his grip tightening. "You're nothing to him, just like I'm nothing. We're both dead men walking." Caleb's heart raced, panic surging through him as Rivers' grip tightened. He could see the fear in the man's eyes, the hopelessness that had pushed him to the edge. For a split second, Caleb thought Rivers might snap, that this desperate, broken man would do something reckless. "Let go of me," Caleb gasped, his voice shaking. But Rivers didn't let go. His eyes were filled with something darker now, a mix of fear and fury that sent a chill down Caleb's spine. The man's grip tightened further, and Caleb felt the breath being squeezed out of him. "I can't go back without an answer," Caleb choked out, trying to pry Rivers' hands off his collar. "Please, just answer?" Rivers hissed, his voice dangerously low. "There's only one answer for men like William, and it's not going to come from me." Caleb's pulse pounded in his ears, and in that moment, he realized just how far gone Rivers was. There was no reasoning with him. He was a man backed into a corner, and he would do anything to survive, even if it meant taking Caleb down with him. Before Caleb could react, Rivers shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. He hit the wall with a painful thud, gasping for breath as his vision swam. Rivers stood there, his chest heaving, his hands trembling with rage and fear. "I can't do this," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible as he tried to steady himself. "I don't want to be part of this." Rivers stared at him for a long moment, his expression softening for just a second. "Neither do I," he whispered, his voice cracking. But it was too late. Caleb had already crossed the line, and there was no going back now. Caleb leaned against the cold wall of the apartment, his body trembling from the shock of Rivers' sudden outburst. His heart raced, every breath a struggle to steady himself. The room was thick with tension, the silence between them broken only by the ragged sound of Rivers' breathing. The man stood frozen, as if the rage that had consumed him moments before had drained from his body, leaving behind only exhaustion and fear. "I'm sorry," Rivers whispered, his voice hoarse. His eyes were wide, the fire that had ignited them moments earlier now replaced with something much sadder. "I didn't mean to," he shook his head, running a hand through his disheveled hair, looking lost. I don't know what else to do." Caleb felt the weight of those words. They mirrored his own thoughts. He didn't know what to do either. He hadn't wanted any of this, hadn't wanted to be caught in a web spun by someone like William Blackwood. But here he was, in too deep, with no way out. For a brief moment, the air between them shifted. Caleb saw something in Rivers that he hadn't seen before. A reflection of his own desperation. Rivers wasn't a bad man. He was just a man who had run out of options, just like Caleb. "I don't have a choice," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I don't bring William something, he'll make me pay for it." Rivers' face twisted into a bitter smile. "And you think I'm the one who has a choice?" he asked, his voice raw. "You think any of us do once someone like William gets their claws in us?" Caleb swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to argue, to say something that would make it all make sense, but the truth was, Rivers was right. There was no choice, not for him, not for Rivers. Once William had you in his grasp, there was no escape. "I'll figure something out," Rivers muttered, pacing again, his hands fidgeting. Maybe I can sell what's left of the car. It's not worth much, but it might buy me a little more time." He spoke quickly, his voice growing more frantic with every word. Caleb watched him, a pit growing in his stomach. He had never felt more helpless in his life. Rivers was scrambling to find a solution, any solution, but Caleb knew it wouldn't be enough. William wouldn't accept excuses, and he wouldn't wait any longer. Rivers was out of time. "Rivers," Caleb started, his voice hesitant. He wasn't sure what to say, but he needed to say something, anything to break the hopeless spiral that Rivers was falling into. "Even if you sell the car, it won't be enough. William's not going to wait. You know that." Rivers stopped pacing, his back turned to Caleb. His shoulders slumped, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a deep sigh, he turned to face Caleb, his eyes filled with a kind of resignation Caleb had never seen before. It was the look of a man who knew he had lost. "I know," Rivers said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've known for a while." The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. Rivers had already given up. He had been fighting, yes, but deep down, he had known all along that there was no way out. Caleb suddenly felt sick. This was what William did. He didn't just take money. He took hope. He took people's lives and twisted them until they were unrecognizable. "I didn't want it to come to this," Rivers said, his voice shaking. "But there's something you don't know, Caleb. Something Williams kept from you." Caleb frowned, confusion flashing across his face. "What are you talking about?" Rivers hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door, as if he was afraid someone might be listening. Then, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "William, he's not just collecting debts. He's using you. You're not just some errand boy. You're part of something bigger, something darker." A chill ran down Caleb's spine. He had always suspected that William was hiding something, that there was more to his empire than just money and power, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all too real. "Using me?" Caleb asked, his voice hoarse. "For what?" Rivers' gaze hardened, and for the first time since Caleb had arrived, he saw a spark of defiance in the man's eyes. "He wants you to take the fall for something. I don't know what exactly, but I know enough to understand that you're a pawn in his game. You and I, we're nothing to him. He's setting you up for something you won't come back from." The room felt like it was closing in around Caleb, his pulse quickening as Rivers' words sunk in. Was that why William had been so cold, so distant? Was this why he had pushed Caleb into doing these dangerous tasks? It all started to make sense now. The secrecy, the demands, the way William watched him like he was testing his limits. "What do you mean?" Caleb asked, his voice shaking. "What does he want me to do?" Rivers glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "I overheard something, back when I still had a place at the table. William's setting up a deal, something big, something illegal. He needs someone to take the blame if it all goes wrong. That someone is you." Caleb's stomach lurched. The room spun, his thoughts racing as the reality of what Rivers was saying hit him like a ton of bricks. He was being set up. William had never seen him as anything more than a disposable tool. Everything he had done for him, all the promises, the tasks, it had all been leading to this. Caleb's hands began to shake as he struggled to process what Rivers had just told him. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he asked, his voice thick with anger and betrayal. Rivers' face softened, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. "I thought I could handle it on my own," he admitted. "I thought I could find a way out, but now I don't have a choice either. If you go down, I go down." William made sure of that. The weight of it all crashed down on Caleb, nearly overwhelming him. Everything he had done, every decision he had made, had been leading him to this moment. And now, he was trapped. He couldn't go back to William empty-handed, but he couldn't keep pretending he didn't know the truth either. I can't do this," Caleb muttered, his voice cracking as panic clawed at his chest. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up to take the fall for William." "You don't have a choice," Rivers said softly, his voice filled with sympathy. "None of us do." For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. The truth hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Caleb felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss that he couldn't escape from. But then, something shifted inside him. He wasn't going to let William control him anymore. He wasn't going to let himself be used. Not like this. Caleb had spent too long fighting to survive, to claw his way out of the darkness. He wasn't about to let William throw him to the wolves. "There has to be a way out," Caleb said, his voice firm, even as fear still gnawed at the edges of his resolve. "We can figure something out. Together." Rivers looked at him, his eyes filled with doubt. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm done being William's pawn," Caleb said, his voice steady now. "If he's setting me up, then we need to find a way to turn the tables on him. Expose him. Something." Rivers shook his head. "You don't understand how powerful he is. Going up against William Blackwood, it's suicide." "Maybe," Caleb replied, his heart racing, "but it's better than waiting around for him to destroy us." Rivers stared at him for a long moment, the weight of Caleb's words sinking in. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly, "but if we're going to do this, we need a plan. A real plan." Caleb nodded, determination hardening inside him. For the first time since stepping into William's world, he wasn't just reacting. He was taking control. It was a dangerous game, but it was better than the alternative. Together, they would bring William down. The weight of their decision hung heavy between them as Rivers and Caleb sat in the small, dim apartment. The world outside seemed distant, a blur of noise and chaos, but in that moment, it felt like they were the only two people in existence. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, the gravity of what he had just proposed settling over him like a storm cloud. They were going to take down William Blackwood. Caleb could hardly believe the words that had come out of his mouth. The idea felt impossible, terrifying even, but at the same time, it was the only choice left. He wasn't going to go down quietly, wasn't going to let William use him and discard him like so many others. He had fought his entire life to survive, and now he was ready to fight back. "We need to be smart about this," Rivers said quietly, his voice laced with caution. "William has power, connections. If we make one wrong move, we're both dead." Caleb nodded, his jaw clenched tight. He knew Rivers was right. William wasn't the kind of man you could just outmaneuver easily. He controlled everything. The money, the people, the information. And in his world, anyone who went against him disappeared. But Caleb wasn't thinking about fear anymore. He was thinking about survival, about taking control of his fate. "How do we get to him?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "We don't have proof of what he's planning. We don't have anything." Rivers hesitated for a moment before glancing around the room, as if checking to make sure no one else could hear them. He took a deep breath and leaned in closer. "There's one thing," he said quietly, almost as if speaking the words would put them in danger. "I overheard something during one of the meetings with William's inner circle. He's planning something big, a deal that involves high-level money laundering." Caleb's eyes widened. Money laundering. It was something he had always suspected but never had proof of. William wasn't just rich, he was dirty. He had built his empire on secrets, lies, and illegal money. That was the kind of leverage Caleb needed to bring him down. "If we can find evidence of that," Caleb said, his mind racing, "we can use it to expose him. He's careful, but no one's untouchable." Rivers nodded slowly, but there was a deep line of worry etched across his forehead. "But it's not that simple," he warned. "The deal is happening soon, and William has safeguards in place. We'd need access to his private accounts, records, something concrete that shows he's laundering money." Caleb frowned, his heart sinking. Accessing William's private accounts wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. William guarded his secrets more carefully than anything else. But if they were going to survive, if they were going to take him down, they had to find a way. What about his office? Caleb asked, his mind shifting to the dark, cold room where William always conducted his business. He keeps everything close. Maybe we can find something there. Rivers looked at him skeptically. You think William just leaves incriminating documents lying around for anyone to find? Caleb's stomach twisted, knowing how risky the idea was. But it was all they had. No, Caleb admitted. But there has to be something. He's not going to hide everything off-site. He's too paranoid for that. He'll want to keep an eye on it. Rivers shook his head, his expression grim. Even if he does, getting into his office without setting off alarms is a suicide mission. You'd need a way to bypass his security, and I can promise you, it's not just locked doors and cameras. Caleb knew Rivers was right, but his mind was already working through the details. He had been in William's office enough times to know how carefully it was guarded. But there had to be a way in, a moment where William let his guard down. There's one person who can get us in, Caleb said slowly, his mind settling on a single idea that filled him with dread. James. Rivers looked at him, his eyes widening with disbelief. James? William's personal driver? The guy who's practically his shadow? Exactly, Caleb said. He's always by William's side. He's seen everything. He might not know the full extent of what William's into, but if anyone has access to that office, it's him. Rivers looked at Caleb like he was crazy. You think James is just going to betray William? He's loyal to the bone. He'd never turn on him. Caleb's mind raced, searching for a way to make it work. Loyalty only goes so far, he said, his voice firm. James has to know something. Maybe he's seen enough to start having doubts. If I can talk to him, get him to see what William's really doing, maybe. Just maybe we can convince him to help. Rivers scoffed, leaning back in his chair. And what if you can't? What if he rats you out the second you say anything? Caleb swallowed hard. The truth was, there was no guarantee, but it was the only lead they had. And right now, they didn't have the luxury of playing it safe. It's a risk we have to take, Caleb said quietly. If we do nothing, William wins. And I'm not going to let that happen. Rivers fell silent, his expression dark as he stared down at the floor. Caleb could see the fear in his eyes, the doubt gnawing at him. But Caleb wasn't going to let that stop him. He had already come too far to back down now. So what's the plan? Rivers asked finally, his voice heavy with resignation. Caleb leaned forward, his eyes locked on Rivers. We get to James. I'll talk to him, make him understand what William's doing. If we can convince him, we use his access to get into the office, find the evidence we need, and bring it to the authorities. Rivers frowned, rubbing a hand over his tired face. And if it all goes wrong? If James doesn't help? Caleb hesitated, the reality of the risk settling over him. If it goes wrong, then we're already dead. That night, Caleb lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He knew that talking to James was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. If they didn't find a way to bring William down soon, everything would fall apart. The thought of what William would do if he found out terrified him. He had seen the cold ruthlessness in William's eyes, the way he disposed of people who crossed him. But Caleb wasn't afraid anymore. Not in the same way he had been when he first met William. Now, the fear was different. It wasn't about what William might do to him. It was about what Caleb might lose if he didn't act. He had made a choice the day he accepted William's offer, the day he climbed into that limousine. But now, he had another choice. He could either keep running, keep hiding from the truth, or he could face it head-on. And for the first time, Caleb knew exactly what he had to do. The next morning, Caleb waited outside the mansion, his eyes scanning the driveway as James pulled up in the sleek black car. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as James stepped out, his usual unreadable expression fixed in place. "Morning," James said quietly, nodding toward Caleb. "Morning," Caleb replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He glanced around, making sure no one was watching before he took a deep breath and stepped closer to James. "We need to talk." James raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing slightly. "About what?" "About William," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About what he's really doing." James' expression didn't change, but Caleb could see the tension in his jaw. "Careful, Caleb," James warned, his voice low. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Caleb's heart raced. This was it, the moment everything hinged on. "I know exactly what I'm getting into," Caleb said, his voice firm. "And so do you." James stared at him for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Caleb could feel the weight of his gaze, the judgment, the hesitation. But then, something shifted in James' expression. A flicker of doubt, of uncertainty. "What do you want?" James asked quietly, his voice barely audible. Caleb swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. "I want you to help me. I want you to help me bring him down." The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. Caleb's heart raced, every second feeling like an eternity. And then, finally, James nodded. "I'm in. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.